Story 1. I've never been the type to scare easily. I don't watch horror movies and then sleep with the lights on. I don't get spooked by every little creak in the floorboards. And I definitely don't buy into ghost stories the way some people do. That being said, there's one night I'll never be able to explain. It still makes my skin crawl when I think about it, because the timing of it all was just too perfect to be random. It was the middle of the night, the kind of quiet where the whole house feels like it's holding its breath. I was dead asleep when a sharp sound woke me. It was strange, like a tiny object had been flicked across my desk. You know the noise when something small and metallic hits wood, bounces once or twice, and then comes to rest? That's exactly what I heard. For a moment I thought I had dreamed it, but then I sat up and realized I was fully awake. I leaned over, turned on the lamp next to my bed, and scanned the desk across the room. Everything looked normal. No papers out of place, no pens rolling, no mess. It was silent again, like the sound had never happened. I shook it off and started to settle back into bed. But just as I pulled my blanket back, something happened that made my stomach drop. Without warning, the heavy steel gumball machine I kept on a shelf above my bed toppled forward and landed right on my pillow. It wasn't some cheap plastic toy either. It was the old-fashioned kind, easily 20 pounds of solid metal and glass. The exact spot it landed was where my head had been, not even 30 seconds before. If I hadn't woken up to that noise, if I hadn't sat up when I did, that machine would have smashed into my skull. For a few seconds I was frozen, just staring at it. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. Then instinct kicked in, and I scrambled out of bed, nearly tripping over myself in the process. My mind went blank, running through half a dozen possibilities at once. Did the shelf finally give way? Did I bump something earlier that made it unstable? But none of that explained the timing or the sound that had woken me right before it fell. That's when I felt something strange under my foot. At first I thought it was just a pen or maybe a button I had dropped earlier. But when I bent down and picked it up, I realized it was a paperclip. A single, bent paperclip sitting there on the floor, right where my foot had landed. The same exact kind of noise I'd heard minutes earlier, like one had been flicked across my desk. Only problem was, I didn't remember dropping it, and I definitely didn't remember leaving one on the floor by my bed. Trying to calm myself, I picked up the paperclip and placed it back on the desk. I moved the gumball machine off the bed and onto the floor, just in case. I checked the shelf, checked the brackets holding it up, and everything was solid. It didn't make sense why it had fallen. The whole time I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the room. The air felt heavier, thicker, like it was pressing down on me. I ended up crawling back under the covers, pulling the blanket up to my chin, and just waiting for morning. The rest of the night was uneventful. Nothing else moved, no other noises, no more paper clips mysteriously appearing. But I couldn't sleep. I just kept staring at that shelf, then at the paper clip sitting on my desk, then back at the machine on the floor. My mind ran through every possible explanation. Maybe the vibration from me moving around earlier had loosened it. Maybe I had actually knocked the paperclip onto the floor before bed and just didn't remember. Maybe the sound I thought had woken me up was just the start of the machine shifting before it fell. But no matter how many times I circled back, the timing didn't add up. The sound and the fall were too connected, almost like one had been a warning for the other. In the morning, I looked at the setup again in daylight. The shelf was fine, the brackets tight, nothing wobbly. The machine had been sitting there for months without issue, and I hadn't touched it recently. It was as if something or someone had decided to knock it off at that exact moment. The rational side of me wanted to dismiss it as a freak coincidence, but the part of me replaying the noise, the paperclip, the fall, couldn't quite believe it was random. I've never had anything like that happen since. No flying paperclips, no falling objects, no strange sounds in the night. Just that one night. And maybe that's what makes it so creepy. It was a one-time thing, sudden, unexplained, and targeted in a way that felt personal. Like whatever it was had only needed one chance to make itself known. I don't tell this story often because I know how it sounds. If someone else had told me, I probably would have brushed it off too. A shelf failed, something fell, big deal. But when you live through it, When you're woken up by a noise only to have something heavy crash onto the exact spot you were just lying in, it changes how you think about coincidences. To this day, I still don't know if it was just bad luck or something else, but I'll never forget the way that room felt after it happened. Like the walls were holding on to a secret I wasn't supposed to understand. And that's the part that still makes my skin crawl. Story 2. People always say that the dead visit you in dreams, but the night I realized that wasn't always true was the night I stopped sleeping with the lights off. I never believed in ghosts or spirits. I was the type to laugh off strange sounds in the house, blaming pipes, wind, or my imagination. But one memory refuses to fade, and no matter how many times I replay it, I can't find a logical answer that makes sense. When I was younger, I was close to Lisa, the daughter of my dad's cousin. Technically my second cousin, but she always felt closer than that. As teenagers, we were almost inseparable. We shared secrets, late-night talks, and moments that blurred the line between friendship and something more. Eventually, we realized it was complicated, maybe even wrong, and when college came around, life pulled us apart. I moved on, or at least I thought I had. Years later, it happened. It was just a normal night. Nothing strange had led up to it. I woke up in the middle of the night needing to use the bathroom. I didn't bother turning on the light, just shuffled half asleep into the hall. The house was silent, that heavy silence that only exists at 3 in the morning when even the walls feel asleep. I finished up, washed my hands, and glanced at the bathroom mirror. That's when I saw her. Lisa was standing in the doorway behind me. My chest locked up. I froze, staring at her reflection instead of turning around. She looked exactly as I remembered, but there was something different. Her skin seemed pale, washed out, like she was being lit by a light that wasn't in the room. I felt my ears ringing, and then I heard her voice. It wasn't loud, but it echoed like it was both inside my head and bouncing off the walls at the same time. She said she still loved me, that she always would. I couldn't breathe. My hands gripped the sink so tightly the porcelain bit into my palms. She stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. I spun around, but the doorway was empty. The hallway stretched into darkness, silent, just as it always had been. My heart was slamming against my ribs, and I tried to convince myself it was a dream. I must have still been half asleep, my brain messing with me. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to ground myself, and went back to bed. That's when it got worse. As soon as I lay down, I smelled her. Not perfume, not shampoo, her scent, the exact one I remembered from years ago. My pillow smelled like she had been lying on it minutes before. I told myself I was just imagining it, that memory and exhaustion were playing tricks. I closed my eyes and tried to block it out. Then I felt the bed shift. It was slight, like the weight of someone lying down behind me. Warmth pressed against my back, familiar in a way that made my skin crawl because I knew it wasn't possible. I lay completely still, my eyes burning from trying not to blink, my mind racing between fight and flight. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I just lay there, feeling that presence, too real to ignore, until at some point exhaustion won and I drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the bed was normal. No indent on the sheets, no warmth, no scent. The house looked the same as it always did, as if nothing had happened. For a while, I convinced myself it had all been a vivid dream, maybe triggered by stress or something I ate. I didn't want to believe it was anything more. Later that day, my phone rang. It was my mom. She sounded shaken, her voice uneven as she told me Lisa had died a few days earlier. Her boyfriend had gotten drunk, things turned violent, and she didn't survive. My stomach dropped, and my mind reeled back to the night before. The reflection in the mirror, the voice, the scent on my pillow, the weight against my back. I didn't know what to say. I just sat there gripping my phone, cold sweat running down my arms. All I could think was that Lisa had come to me one last time. Maybe to say goodbye. Maybe to remind me she still cared. Maybe because I was someone she trusted. I don't know. Even now, I try to find explanations. Sleep paralysis could explain the feeling of her lying next to me. The smell might have been memory playing tricks on me. Maybe stress made me hallucinate. But the mirror, that's the part I can't shake. I was wide awake when I saw her standing there, and the look in her eyes still burns in my memory. Since that night, I've second-guessed everything I thought I knew about life and death. I don't talk about it much because people would probably think I dreamed it or made it up. But I know what I saw, what I smelled, and what I felt. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, I can tell you this much. Lisa was there, and if she wasn't, then I don't want to know what else it could have been. Story 3. I was one of those stubborn kids who could turn the smallest task into a full-scale meltdown. Shoes, for example. I hated tying them. It felt impossible. Like no matter how many times adults tried to show me, the laces just wouldn't work the way they did in their hands. I was about 4 years old, sitting halfway up the staircase in our house, red-faced, bawling, and refusing to try again, while my mom told me we weren't leaving until I tied them. The staircase was narrow, and the way the walls and ceiling came together above it made a weird little corner that always seemed darker than the rest of the hall. I had sat there plenty of times before, crying my lungs out, but that morning was different. At first, I wasn't aware of anything. I was focused on being mad, on stomping my shoes into the carpeted step like I was punishing them for existing. Then, in the middle of a sob, I looked up without thinking. It was instinctive, like my eyes were drawn to the ceiling, and that was when everything stopped. My tears cut off, my breathing slowed, and it was as if my body instantly froze. Because braced in that corner, crouched against the wall and ceiling like he was clinging to it, was a figure I have never forgotten. The man, or at least the body looked like a man, was dressed in a black suit, sharp and perfect, the kind you'd expect to see at a funeral. But his head didn't belong to a man. It was the head of a boar. The fur wasn't brown, though. It was this washed-out blue, pale and unnatural. He had tusks, jagged and white, sticking out in a way that seemed too large for his face. His eyes were fixed on me, staring in a way that made my stomach twist. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stayed crouched in the corner like some kind of predator waiting to pounce. I couldn't scream. I couldn't even cry anymore. My mom noticed the sudden silence and asked what had changed, why I'd gone quiet so fast. She probably thought I'd just worn myself out. But I remember cutting her off before she could finish. My voice was flat, like I wasn't even myself, and I remember saying something that didn't make sense at the time. I don't remember the exact words anymore, but I know I told her I couldn't move because he wouldn't let me. She didn't understand what I meant and came closer, but by the time she stepped onto the bottom stair, whatever had been there was gone. The corner was empty, just ceiling and wall, like it had always been. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave me, not for the rest of the day. The strange part is that the memory never faded the way most childhood fears do. I didn't dream about it, and it wasn't a recurring thing like monsters under the bed. It was a single, clear moment burned into my brain. Every detail of it has stayed sharp, especially the color of his fur and the way he braced himself in the ceiling corner, like gravity didn't matter to him. Years later, when I was older, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a hallucination brought on by the stress of throwing a tantrum. Kids can see things when they're emotional. Maybe the light from the window hit the corner weird and created a shape, and my brain filled in the rest. Maybe the carpet fuzzed my vision through tears. All of those explanations could make sense if it weren't for the way my body reacted. That frozen, instinctive silence. The feeling that he wanted something from me, even though he never moved or spoke. That wasn't just a child's imagination. For a long time, I avoided that staircase corner. I'd rush up and down the stairs, keeping my head low, trying not to glance up. Even when I was a teenager, it still creeped me out. There were no other encounters, nothing physical, but the unease always lingered. My mom never believed me. She thought it was just one of those childhood exaggerations, like kids seeing faces in the closet or shapes in the dark. But to me, it was too real to dismiss. Looking back, it was the first time I genuinely questioned what we know about the world. I wasn't raised religious, and my family never really talked about ghosts or demons. But after that, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe there were things around us we just didn't see unless we caught them at the right moment. I've never seen him again. The man with the boar's head, but the memory has stayed crystal clear, and sometimes when I think about it too long, I wonder if I was supposed to see him that day. He didn't look surprised when I noticed him. If anything, it felt like he had been waiting for me to look. Even now as an adult, I can still picture the way his tusk caught the light, how his eyes locked on mine. I don't know if he was something paranormal or just a trick of a child's brain in meltdown mode, but either way, it left a mark. Because fear like that doesn't just disappear, it sticks with you. And to this day, every time I see a dark corner above a staircase, I feel my chest tighten. And I remember being 4 years old, frozen in place, convinced that something impossible was staring down at me. Story 4. Moving into that apartment felt like stepping into someone else's leftover life. You know the kind of place. Old 3-story walk-up, walls that seemed thinner than paper, floors that carried the weight of every footstep like it was an echo from the past. It wasn't fancy, but at the time, being in my early 20s, cheap rent in Toronto was good enough. It didn't take long for me to realize the place had more than just old paint and creaky pipes holding it together. Within the first week, my roommate Mike complained in the mornings about what he swore was me banging on our shared bedroom wall and pacing around the apartment late at night. I hadn't been doing either. I brushed it off, telling myself it had to be dreams, or maybe thin walls carrying noise from another unit. Still, the way he described it gave me a weird feeling, because his words lined up with the strange sounds I thought I'd been hearing too. We agreed to leave it at that, but the noises never stopped. If anything, they became part of the nightly soundtrack of the apartment. Then there was the smell. It wasn't constant, but when it came, it was impossible to ignore. It was this overpowering mix of cheap perfume and damp rot, like old clothes stuffed in a wet basement next to a litter box. What unsettled me wasn't just the stench itself, but the way it always seemed to arrive with a warning. A sudden wave of dread would hit me first, tightening in my chest and making my skin prickle, and then the smell would seep in. I couldn't explain that part. Why did I always feel it before it happened? Mike didn't last long. After 4 months, he broke the lease and left, claiming he just couldn't handle the place anymore. That left me alone with the rent, which meant I had to find a solution fast. One of my ideas was to sleep in his old room instead of mine, just to see if the vibe was any different. The very first night I tried, I had one of the most disturbing nightmares of my life. It was so vivid it didn't even feel like a dream. I was standing in the bathroom, but it wasn't right. The mirror was shattered, and I was staring at my reflection while holding a shard of glass, dragging it across my own face. The dream ended with the sound of dripping, but I never figured out if it was blood or water. I woke up shaken and sweating. The image burned into my head. The real bathroom mirror wasn't broken, but after that, I could hardly look into it the same way again. Things escalated quickly. I started hearing loud bangs at night, the kind that made the walls shake. The toilet would flush on its own. The bathtub taps would turn themselves on full blast, steam filling the apartment like someone had decided to take a bath in the middle of the night. I kept telling myself it was old plumbing, bad wiring, just the quirks of an aging building. But even repeating that out loud didn't ease the creeping sense that I wasn't the only one in the apartment. The worst moment happened about a month before I finally gave up on the place. I was asleep and woke suddenly to the TV blasting at full volume. It wasn't on when I'd gone to bed. It was one of those old analog sets, the kind where you had to turn a knob to change the channel and pull another knob to power it on. There was no remote, no timer, nothing like that. Yet there it was, blaring in the middle of the night. And the channel? City TV, playing Poltergeist at 2 a.m. It wasn't just the timing that got to me. It was the fact that of all movies, that was the one it came on with. By that point, I didn't need anyone else to confirm what I was experiencing. Mike had already left, and the things I'd gone through in those rooms were more than enough. I moved out before the lease was up, not even caring about the money I'd lose. People ask why I didn't just tough it out, and I don't really have a good answer, except this. Living there felt like living with something that wanted me to notice it, wanted me to stay awake at night thinking about it. Maybe it was just bad wiring and old plumbing. Maybe it was the building shifting under its age. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But the smell, the nightmare, the banging, the water, and that TV, It all stacked up into something I couldn't ignore. Even now, years later, I sometimes catch a whiff of that same stale perfume out of nowhere, and every time my stomach sinks. Maybe I carried it with me, or maybe whatever was in that apartment never really stayed behind. I'll never know for sure. Story 5, they say houses breathe. The walls shift with the temperature, wood creaks under its own weight, and pipes groan like a body settling in its sleep. Growing up, I never paid much attention to those sounds. They blended into the background of daily life, the soundtrack of an old house keeping itself alive. But one evening, when the house exhaled a different kind of sound, I realized not everything could be explained by settling wood and humming pipes. I was maybe 13 at the time, stretched out on the living room couch with a paperback book in my hand. My older brother had this music software on his computer, something he used to compose piano pieces. He wasn't a professional by any means, but he loved tinkering with it, layering notes until he had something that almost sounded polished. I had grown so used to hearing him mess around on the program that the faint notes drifting down the hallway were part of the house's normal soundscape. Except this time, it wasn't piano. From the direction of his room, I started to hear the most beautiful violin melody I had ever listened to. It was soft at first, then it grew fuller, filling the house with a haunting kind of sweetness that made my skin tingle. It wasn't like a recording. There was texture to it, a depth that made me imagine an actual violinist sitting there in his room, pouring their soul into the strings. The notes rose and fell in this way that almost felt alive, carrying emotion that tugged at me. I set my book down without realizing it, completely drawn into the sound. At first, I thought maybe my brother had upgraded his program or added new instruments, but the more I listened, the less it felt like digital music. There were tiny imperfections, the kind you only hear when a human hand drags a bow across strings. Slight hesitations, faint breaths between movements. It lasted for several minutes, weaving through the air so naturally that it felt like the house itself was holding its breath, listening with me. I remember thinking I needed to tell him how incredible it was. This wasn't just his usual hobby. It was something that sounded professional, like something you'd hear in a concert hall. When the melody tapered off and ended on this long, lingering note, I stood up, still half entranced. The hallway seemed darker than usual as I walked toward his room, but I brushed that off as nothing. When I reached his door, the silence hit me like a wall. No violin, no sound of fingers typing at a keyboard, not even the low buzz of his computer fan. The chair was empty, the screen black. And then I remembered, he wasn't even home. I was alone in the house. The realization made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. My first thought was that maybe I had imagined it, that my brain had filled in some sound from outside, or that maybe I had dozed off and dreamed it while reading. But no, I had listened to the whole piece, every single note. It had been real enough to draw me away from my book, real enough to make me walk down that hallway. For the rest of the night, the house felt different. Every small noise made me flinch. The creak of the floor, the hum of the fridge, even the sound of pages turning in my book. I couldn't shake the feeling that the music had been meant for me, like something unseen had chosen that moment to perform. Over the years, I've tried to explain it away. Maybe it was a radio playing somewhere outside, drifting in through the walls. Maybe the computer somehow turned itself on and glitched into playing something I hadn't heard before. But even now, decades later, I can still remember the way that violin sounded, warm and human and alive. Too alive to have come from a program, too close to have come from anywhere but inside that house. That was the night I stopped brushing everything off as imagination. I've lived in a lot of places since then, and I've never heard anything like it again. But whenever I think back, the memory still gives me chills. Not because I was scared in the moment, but because something that beautiful had no reason to exist in that empty house. And if music that real could come from nowhere, then maybe the world has far more hidden layers than we're willing to admit. Story 6. Some memories cling to you like old scars. You don't have to look for them. They're just there, waiting for quiet moments when your mind drifts. That's how I feel about what happened when I was around 7 years old. I can still see it clearly, as if it burned itself into my brain. Every little detail of that night is stuck with me, and no matter how much I try to rationalize it, There's always a piece of me that knows something about it wasn't normal. It was close to the holidays. The kind of time when the house always felt a little different. Decorations were up, boxes of lights were scattered around, and there was that strange coziness mixed with chaos. The house I grew up in had 3 levels: the main floor, a basement below, and a downstairs space that kind of connected them. It wasn't creepy most of the time, but when night fell, the downstairs especially always seemed darker than it should have been. The kind of dark where the corners looked too deep, like shadows piled on top of each other. That day, I had spent hours watching movies on the couch, working through the stack of VHS tapes my parents rented for the holiday break. At some point, I had left my pillow downstairs, too comfortable to notice at the time. Later that night, when the house had settled and most of the noise had died down, I decided to go grab it before heading to bed. That trip down the stairs is something I'll never forget. As soon as I stepped into the downstairs room, the atmosphere hit me. It wasn't cold exactly, but the air felt thick, heavier somehow. The only light was the faint glow from the kitchen upstairs, spilling through the doorway. It made the downstairs space look dim, uneven, like the shadows had more control than the light did. I remember telling myself it was nothing, just the usual nighttime creepiness. I walked over, grabbed my pillow off the couch, and when I stood back up, and that's when everything changed. Across the room on the far side, there was a man. At first I thought maybe it was my dad or someone messing around, but within seconds I knew it wasn't. He was dressed in clothes that looked way too formal for being inside the house, like something out of an old photograph. Suit, polished shoes, the whole thing. The strangest part was that he wasn't in color. Everything about him, from head to toe, was completely gray. Not pale, not washed out, just gray. His skin, his clothes, even his eyes. I froze on the spot, pillow clutched against my chest. He wasn't even looking at me at first. He seemed to be wandering the room, scanning things, like someone inspecting a place they didn't belong to. My heart started hammering because deep down I knew no one else was supposed to be there. And then it got worse. The man turned his head slowly, as if he suddenly realized I could see him. Our eyes locked, and in that instant, the whole world seemed to stop. His mouth opened, but not in a normal way. His jaw dropped so wide, so unnaturally low, it looked like it was trying to unhinge. No sound came out, but I could feel it. A silent scream aimed directly at me. The sight was so wrong, so unnatural, that it rooted me to the floor. Before I could even process what I was seeing, he bolted. Not like a normal person, though. He didn't run toward the door or even across the room in a straight line. He rushed forward and went straight through the wall, vanishing completely as if he'd never been there at all. 1 second, he was screaming silently at me. The next, gone. I don't know how long I stood there afterward. Could have been seconds, could have been minutes. My body wouldn't move. My mind kept trying to tell me it wasn't real, that maybe I had just imagined it. But I know what I saw. The detail of his suit, the way his shoes looked polished, the exact shade of gray that washed out everything about him. It wasn't some trick of light. It was too clear. After that, I couldn't go downstairs in the dark anymore. For years, if the lights weren't on, I'd avoid the whole space entirely. It wasn't until I was a teenager that I finally forced myself to walk down there at night again. And even then, it was only because I had to. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow shifting across the wall, sent my mind right back to that night. Looking back, I've tried to explain it away. Maybe it was a dream I mistook for reality. Maybe the shadows and the dim lighting played tricks on my eyes. Kids have vivid imaginations, and I was young enough to blur the line between fantasy and reality. But deep down, I don't buy those explanations. The fear I felt was too real. It wasn't like the usual childhood spooks. This was different. This was something that marked me. Even now, when I tell the story, I get chills remembering the way his jaw dropped. The silence of it was worse than any scream could have been. I've heard other people say ghosts are faint or blurry, that they fade in and out like smoke. But what I saw wasn't like that. He was solid, detailed, as if he belonged in the room, except for the fact that he was completely drained of life and color. Sometimes I wonder who he was, why he was there, or what he wanted. Was he just passing through, not realizing someone could see him? Or did he notice me because I wasn't supposed to? There are nights I lie awake asking myself whether he would have come closer if I hadn't frozen. I'll never know. All I know is that after that night, I could never think of the downstairs the same way again. That experience left me with a permanent split in my thinking. Part of me still leans on logic and science, wanting to explain it away as imagination or hallucination, but the other part knows the truth, that sometimes reality cracks just enough to let something else slip through. And when it does, you never forget the look of it staring right back at you. Story 7. Some nights feel heavier than others, almost like the air itself is pressing against you, warning you not to do something. That's how it felt the night I decided to sneak out of my childhood home. I was a teenager back then, still living with my parents, and slipping out late was nothing new. I'd usually creep through the back door, careful not to make the hinges squeak, and head down the yard to meet my friends. It was a routine, and I'd gotten cocky with how many times I'd pulled it off. But this night didn't feel normal from the start. The moment I stepped onto the back porch, I got that strange prickling sensation you feel when someone's eyes are locked on you. It was so sudden that my first thought was that my dad had caught me red-handed. I froze, heart racing, waiting for him to call me out. But instead of hearing footsteps or a voice, the silence only grew thicker. Even the usual sounds of the night, crickets, rustling leaves, the faint hum of traffic seemed to dim. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but deep down I knew something about this moment wasn't right. I turned slowly, expecting to see one of my parents standing there, arms crossed in the doorway. What I saw instead didn't fit into anything I understood. A figure stood in front of me, completely monochrome, as if every bit of color had been drained away. Her hair was the first thing I noticed. So dark it was like staring into a void. The face was worse. It wasn't a face at all, more like the static fuzz of an old television screen, white and gray with no features to hold on to. She wore a dress that matched the strange black and white palette, blending somewhere in between. No eyes, no mouth, no expression. Just the outline of a young girl silently facing me. Every instinct screamed at me to get back inside. I lunged for the door, slamming it shut faster than I thought possible. But as it closed, it felt like something pushed back against it for a split second, almost making it snap shut on its own. The sound echoed through the kitchen, louder than it should have been, like the whole house wanted to announce my failure to sneak out. My heart pounded as I stood there in the dark, pressed against the door frame, waiting to hear footsteps. None came. I didn't stop to think. I bolted across the yard, every patch of grass crunching under my shoes like an alarm. The air felt wrong, colder, heavier, like it was dragging against me as I ran. Even once I hit the street, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was right behind me. The streetlights flickered as I passed under them, and every shadow stretched in ways that didn't match the trees or the fences. My brain kept insisting it was just my imagination running wild, but my gut told me otherwise. By the time I made it to my friend's house, I was drenched in sweat. I didn't tell them exactly what I'd seen. I figured they'd laugh or tell me I was just seeing things in the dark. Instead, I just said I didn't feel safe at home that night, but I didn't sleep much, not even in the comfort of their room. Every creak of the house, every shift of the air vent, made me think the monochrome girl had followed me and was just waiting for me to be alone again. Looking back now, years later, I've tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was a shadow cast at the wrong angle. Maybe the mix of moonlight and streetlight played tricks on my eyes. Maybe I was already on edge about sneaking out, and my brain invented something terrifying to scare me straight. But the problem with that explanation is that I can still remember how real it felt. I can still picture her standing there, colorless, faceless, staring without eyes. The memory hasn't faded or warped with time. It's just as sharp as it was that night. The part that unsettles me the most, though, is the door. I can't explain how it shut so quickly, almost like something had yanked it from the other side. Old hinges don't behave like that, and I'd used that door countless times without anything unusual happening. It wasn't just paranoia, it was physical, and I felt it. That more than anything keeps me from writing it off as nothing. To this day, when I think back on my childhood home, it's not the family memories or the good times that come to mind first. It's that girl, The faceless figure who shouldn't have been there, who didn't make a sound, and who left me with the unshakable feeling that she knew exactly what I was doing that night. I'll never know if she was some kind of ghost, a trick of my tired eyes, or something else entirely. But what I do know is that the fear was real. The feeling of being followed was real, and the way the world went silent around me in that moment was real. And because of that, I've never truly felt alone in the dark again. Story 8. Mornings have always felt like the quietest part of the day to me. The world is still half asleep, and even the air feels heavy, like it hasn't fully woken up yet. Back when I was about 16, I thought of mornings as nothing more than a blur before school. Tired eyes, dragging feet. The same routine repeated every single day. But one morning cut through that monotony so hard that I still think about it now, years later, and wonder if I really experienced what I think I did. It started like any other weekday. My alarm went off around 6 and the house was silent. My parents were heavy sleepers, my siblings the same, so I knew I'd be the first one up. I crept downstairs to the bathroom, still barely conscious, half on autopilot. The house always felt different at that hour. There was something about the way shadows stretched in the corners, or how the silence wasn't peaceful but thick, like you weren't supposed to break it. I never gave it much thought back then. I just wanted to get my shower done and maybe catch a few more minutes of sitting around before school. I stepped into the shower and let the hot water hit me, trying to shake off the grogginess. My eyes stung with sleep, and I remember blinking hard just to stay awake. For the first few minutes, everything was completely normal. Then I heard the faintest sound of the door handle shifting. I assumed it was one of my siblings wanting to come in, so without much thought, I said loudly that the bathroom was occupied. Normally, that was enough, but this time things were different. The handle didn't stop. Instead, it began to rattle violently, like whoever was outside was desperate to get in. The noise echoed in the small bathroom, sharp and unnatural against the sound of running water. The knocking started right after. Slow at first, then harder, faster, almost angry. I froze, staring at the door through the shower's steam, my heart suddenly racing. It wasn't the usual annoyed tap of someone wanting their turn. This was aggressive, relentless, as if the person on the other side wasn't just impatient, but furious. I called out again, this time telling them to knock it off. My voice didn't sound like mine. It was shaky, higher pitched than usual, but the handle just kept jerking up and down, harder and harder, until I was sure it was about to snap off. The pounding on the door was so loud I thought for sure my family would wake up, but no one stirred. No footsteps on the stairs, no voices, just me, the banging and the sound of metal clattering as the handle fought against the lock. At that point, every rational part of me was scrambling for explanations. Maybe it was my brother messing with me. Maybe it was my dad, irritated that I was taking too long. But none of that added up. My brother hated mornings more than anyone I knew, and my dad would never waste his time rattling a door like that. The persistence didn't feel like a prank. It felt darker than that, more intent. Then just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The handle stilled. The knocking ceased. The silence afterward was suffocating. I stood frozen in the shower, barely breathing, water still hitting my back. I waited for someone to say something, to stomp away down the hall, to give me some kind of clue about what had just happened. But there was nothing, not a sound in the whole house. When I finally worked up the nerve to step out, I dried off quickly, heart still thundering, and opened the bathroom door. The hallway outside was empty. I checked each of my siblings' rooms one by one. They were all still in bed, sound asleep, undisturbed. My parents' room was the same. Everyone was asleep. Everyone. I tried to brush it off that morning, telling myself maybe I was half asleep and imagined it, or maybe the door was faulty and shifted on its own somehow. But I knew what I saw. I saw the handle moving violently up and down. I heard the furious pounding. You don't mistake something like that, not when it feels so real in the moment. For weeks after, I avoided showering in the mornings. I started taking them at night, telling myself it was just easier that way. But the truth was, I couldn't face being alone in that bathroom at 6 in the morning again. Every time I passed by, I felt uneasy, like if I lingered too long, the handle would start moving again. Sometimes I swore I heard faint tapping at the door, when no one was in there. But I never had the guts to check. To this day, I don't know what it was. Maybe I was hallucinating from lack of sleep. Maybe the old house had quirks I didn't understand. But it never happened again, and that almost makes it worse. Like whatever was trying to get in that morning had one chance, and I just happened to be there when it did. It left me with a permanent unease, a reminder that sometimes things happen with no clear explanation. I don't like telling this story often because it sounds so simple compared to other people's paranormal encounters, but the simplicity is what makes it terrifying. There was nothing elaborate, no dramatic shadow figure or glowing apparition, just a locked bathroom door, a furious, unseen force trying to get inside, and me stuck on the other side with nowhere to go. That's what makes it stick with me. Even now when I think about it, I can feel my stomach tighten the way it did that morning. I can picture the handle shaking uncontrollably, metal scraping against metal, and hear the pounding that seemed like it would never stop. I've convinced myself over and over that there has to be a rational explanation, but when I replay it in my head, it always feels like something beyond that, something I can't quite name. And that's the part that still keeps me up at night. Story 9. Some houses just carry a weight about them, like the air is thicker inside than outside. That's how my great-grandmother's place always felt to me. It wasn't a creepy house by design. It wasn't falling apart or painted dark. And it didn't look like one of those stereotypical haunted mansions you'd see in movies. From the outside, it looked perfectly normal, even cozy. But the moment you stepped through the front door, there was this heavy quiet that didn't feel right, like the house was listening, like the walls themselves were holding back something you weren't supposed to notice. I spent a lot of time there as a kid, usually sitting in the living room where she kept most of her old furniture. That room had the kind of smell you only find in old homes, a mix of dust, old wood, and something faintly floral, like potpourri that had been sitting out too long. The curtains were always drawn halfway, leaving just enough light to stretch shadows into the corners. I never liked sitting in there alone, but family visits meant you didn't have much choice. Everyone else acted normal, but I always felt uneasy. Over the years, little things happened that kept that uneasy feeling alive. Doors would click shut on their own when no draft was around. Glasses on the counter sometimes shifted just slightly, enough to notice but never enough to convince anyone else it wasn't just my imagination. Even the old grandfather clock in the hallway would sometimes chime at strange times, completely off schedule, though my great-grandmother would brush it off and say the mechanism was just old. No one really called it paranormal out loud, but it was clear to me that people noticed. They just chose not to acknowledge it. The living room itself was the worst. There was something about that space that felt charged. It wasn't one specific thing, more like a collection of subtle details that piled up into dread. The air in there always seemed a little colder, especially near the coffee table. Shadows clung stubbornly to the corners, no matter how bright the lights were turned on. Even the family dog refused to step inside. She would stand at the doorway, staring, ears pinned back, before backing away. Animals know things, and watching her react that way only fueled my anxiety. One day I was sitting in that room while my mother smoked in the kitchen. She had left her lighter on the table in front of me. It was just an ordinary disposable lighter, nothing special about it. I remember staring at it for a while, almost absent-mindedly, because there wasn't much else to do. That's when I started to feel it again. That strange heaviness pressing in from all sides, like the air itself was waiting. At first I thought I heard something faint, almost like a low hum or vibration. It wasn't coming from any device, and the television was off. The sound seemed to sink into the walls and floor, almost too soft to be real. The longer I sat there, the more tense I felt. My eyes kept darting to the doorway, half expecting someone to walk in, but no one came. The shadows near the corners of the room seemed darker than usual, as if the dim light couldn't quite reach them. Then out of nowhere, it happened. The lighter, which had been sitting perfectly still on the table, shot across the room. Not slid, not tipped, but launched. It flew in a clean arc straight into the wall and embedded itself just enough to stick out at an angle. The sound of it hitting the wall was sharp, like a nail being driven in, and it froze me in place. My brain scrambled for explanations. Maybe I had twitched the table. Maybe it was already at the edge and gravity just tipped it over. But none of those made sense. The room was closed, no windows open, no breeze. There had been no movement on my part. I just sat there staring at it, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I remember glancing around the room, expecting to see someone else, some prankster hiding, but there was nothing. The space was empty. I finally stood up and walked over, hands shaking, and saw the lighter lodged in the wall like it had been thrown by an actual hand. That's when the fear really set in, because I knew no one had touched it. Later, when I told my mother about it, she looked at me strangely, but didn't seem as surprised as I expected. She didn't accuse me of lying or exaggerating. Instead, she muttered something about how weird things had always happened in that house. My great-grandmother, when told, just brushed it off like it was nothing unusual, saying she'd lived there long enough to stop caring about objects moving on their own. That reaction almost made it worse. If they had freaked out like I did, I could have chalked it up to a shared scare. But the fact they were so calm told me it wasn't new to them. The skeptic in me still tries to reason it out. Maybe the table had some vibration, maybe the lighter was already balanced oddly, and just happened to fall in the strangest way possible. But deep down, I know it wasn't that. I know what I saw. It didn't fall, it flew. There was intent behind it, like someone or something had decided to prove a point. Even now, years later, I can still picture it happening in slow motion. The silence of the room, the sudden movement, the impossible impact on the wall. Every time I think about it, the same chill creeps over me, the kind that makes your skin prickle. I've never been able to step into that living room again without feeling like something is watching, waiting. I don't know what that house holds, but I do know one thing. Whatever is there, it wants me to notice. Story 10. Some places have a way of swallowing sound, like the air itself decides to press pause on the world. That's the feeling I got the morning I went running at the Hale Homestead in Connecticut. I had always been the kind of person who relied on my legs and my watch to map out new trails, not signs or guideposts. And since I couldn't find a map online, I figured 30 minutes of steady running would get me roughly 4 miles. It was simple math, nothing complicated. When I started, it was just a normal Monday morning. Around 9 o'clock, everything was as you'd expect in a wooded area not far from a highway. The birds were busy in the trees. The faint hum of Route 31 carried in the background. And every now and then a squirrel would dart across the trail as if to remind me I was on its turf. The dirt paths wound around in so many directions that I had to rely on instinct and my own sense of direction to keep from wandering aimlessly. I didn't feel lost, though I knew someone less confident could have easily ended up running in circles. Around 20 minutes in, something unusual caught my eye. Off to my right, about 50 meters away through the trees, there was what looked like a coffin. Not an old, broken one like you might find abandoned, but polished, light-colored wood gleaming faintly in the shade. It was so out of place that I slowed down just to make sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. I kept moving, expecting that once I got closer, I'd either confirm it or realize it was just a fallen log. But when I rounded a small bend, the view opened up, and the coffin was gone. In its place was nothing but a patch of ferns. I froze, staring, trying to piece together how something so distinct could vanish. That was enough to shift my mood. The run no longer felt routine. I decided I'd turn around and head back to the car instead of finishing my planned route. About half a mile from the lot, I heard a sound that made my stomach drop, a knocking on a tree. It was rhythmic, deliberate. 2 quick knocks, then 3 close together, mimicking that old tune, Shave and a Haircut. But it stopped short. No 2 bits to finish it. At first I told myself it had to be a woodpecker or some random animal making odd noises. But before I could convince myself, the same pattern sounded again from up ahead on a different tree. The timing was too clean to be chance. The path widened then, and I could see the opening to the parking lot far ahead. I picked up the pace, wanting nothing more than to be back at the car. Just as I started to relax, the knocks came again, this time from a tree directly to my left. They were louder now, so clear it felt like they were right at ear level. My chest tightened, and I ran harder, eyes locked on the clearing. That's when everything shifted. It was like the world itself hit pause. The air turned sharp and cold, dropping at least 20 degrees in what felt like a blink. The forest fell dead silent. No birds, no rustle of leaves. My watch, which had been steadily ticking away, suddenly freaked out. Beeping in strange patterns, the numbers glitching across the display. I remember staring at it while still running, not understanding how something digital could look so scrambled, and then the knocking hit again. Only this time, it wasn't from one tree. It was from every direction. The pattern boomed through the woods, each knock echoing as though someone was striking every trunk around me with an axe. The rhythm was exact, but it felt impossibly loud, like it was being forced directly into my head. An overwhelming sense of dread hit me hard, the kind that makes your body move before your brain catches up. I sprinted, every nerve screaming at me to just get to the car. Somehow, I burst out into the parking lot, and instantly everything reset. The sun warmed my skin again, the birds were back, and the air was alive with normal summer sounds. My chest heaved, and for a moment, I stood frozen, too scared to even look behind me. When I glanced at my watch, the screen had gone completely blank. I tapped at it, pressed buttons, and then out of nowhere, it lit up again. But instead of my time, it displayed a factory reset, 12 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds. Monday, January 1st. I stared at it in disbelief. My watch had never done anything like that before. Even worse, when I started the car, the dashboard clock also read 12 o'clock, though I knew it had to be closer to 9:45 by then. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. I was trying to convince myself to calm down when I heard it again, one last time. A sharp rap, this time on the rear window of my car. My whole body went cold. I hadn't seen a single car in the lot when I started my run, and no one had arrived since. The sound was so close, like knuckles against glass. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My only thought was to get out of there, so I slammed the car into drive and tore out onto the road. When I finally got back to my grandmother's lake house, I sat in the car for a long time, trying to process what had happened. I kept telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the coffin was a trick of light, the knocks were just a bird, the watch glitch was a coincidence. But when I thought about the way the air had gone silent, the cold that sank into my bones, and the synchronized knocks hammering from every direction, I couldn't explain it away. Even now, I don't know what I ran into that morning. All I know is that I'll never set foot on those trails again.